Brett Okamoto covers the UFC and MMA as a whole for ESPN. Joining me on the show as we get into what is next after the news that came out yesterday with Jon Jones, the UFC, and more. Brett, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Josh. How you doing?
I'm doing well, man, but let me tell you, this stuff going on is kind of eye-opening because, you really thought, after what Jon Jones said after his fight, you really felt like you were kind of hoping, you were almost wanting things to get, shall I say, back to normal. And now we find out that, Jon Jones has not been honest. He lied, and he's been caught again, and the UFC is again left without one of their prime stars.
Yeah, it's a really complicated case because what the feelings that you just described are sort of, I think, what everyone who follows the sport really closely felt initially. Right as soon as it happened, it's like, man, of course this happened. This is Jon Jones to a T at this point. It's almost like it gets to a point where we should expect it. And as you mentioned, UFC 214 felt like he'd come out of this dark period of his life, and now everything's fine. So initially, that's what everybody felt. It's just complete disappointment. This guy's now just going away. Like let's just move away from him. I mean, at this point, let's just forget about Jon Jones. Well, now, he's going to appeal this, and the more information that comes out, it really is a really interesting, strange case. I mean, the substance that he tested positive for, when he tested positive for it, cheating is cheating, and maybe he did cheat, but it's weird. If that's your conclusion that Jon Jones did cheat, that he was actively taking something he shouldn't, the pieces aren't in place yet that really make it make sense. So I'm not completely writing off Jon Jones yet. I want to hear out his appeal, but it's just like, man, can't this guy just fight and not be always tied up in these types of circumstances?
Brett, you've been around Jon a lot more than I have, and in my short exposure to him, my sense with him always was that, on one hand, he is self-aware of his celebrity, and he's self-aware of his, how talented he is, but at the same time with that self-awareness, there seems to be, though, a disconnect with reality with him. Do you feel like that moving forward, no matter what happens with him, do you think he's ever going to, get it? Figure out that, he's got to clean up his life. He's got to tighten things up, and he can't just keep rolling around assuming that people are going to keep giving him second, third, and fourth chances.
Yeah, but it's difficult, because he has continued to get second and third chances. So it's like the world around Jon has kind of enabled him. And when you have a world that enables you, then, and you have some of the, I guess, character flaws is a way to put it about Jon. He shoots himself in the foot. He has that tendency. But when the world continues to allow you to do that, well, then you're in a situation where it's going to continue. I mean, and that's what was so great about UFC 214, because it felt like he really walked that line. He came as close as possible to really just completely throwing his life away and being in prison, really. I mean, if something different happens with that hit and run 2 years ago and the injuries are more severe, I mean, he could be sitting in a jail cell right now. So it just kind of felt like it was a sad story. It was a guy who was wasting talent, but hey, he got out of it. He fixed everything. He came back. He looked like himself. He beat his rival, Daniel Cormier. That's why UFC 214 was such a feel-good moment in the sport. Jon Jones is back. The sport has its greatest talent back. And now you're running into this. Will he ever get it? I don't know. I think we got to find out exactly what happens with his appeal. We have to hear his side of the story. We have to wait for all of these drug tests to come back. I mean, this really becomes like a scientific issue at this point. I mean, they're going back and looking through all of the supplements that he's taken, trying to see if one of them was tainted with this. I mean, it's a really complicated, just disappointing story. And what makes it disappointing is that it's just these things tend to follow Jon Jones around. They tend to do so. And will they ever stop? At this point, you got to say probably not, right? I mean, we've just encountered so many of them.
So Brett Okamoto covers MMA and the UFC for ESPN. Brett, looking at the UFC now, we know that Daniel Cormier is going to get the belt back, which, for him, he talked about, I heard him last night talk about how conflicted he is about this. On one hand, he feels like he didn't earn it. On the other hand, he understands that, this has been ruled a no contest. And in the rule book, the fight never happened, or at least the win never happened. At least, what do you think? How is the UFC going to go on from here? Because Jon Jones, he was one of the biggest stars in UFC. He was one of the biggest names in MMA. And you look at how the UFC has gone. This isn't the same way it was, 10, 15 years ago, where the UFC was just, kind of still a fledgling sport. In many ways, the sport has grown and evolved and gotten bigger than ever. And now, realistically, no Jon Jones, no Ronda Rousey, and they're kind of left at the altar without a bride.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's not much they can do, really. They made a decision that they needed to clean up the sport. That the athletic commissions around the country that were drug testing these guys, the drug testing got a little more advanced, and guys were popping left and right. And they made a decision. You know what? We need to get ahead of this. We need to bring in the United States Anti-Doping Agency and test ourselves. And so they've done that, and now they're living with the consequences of it. And there's not much they can do. Again, I mean, where do they go from here? Daniel Cormier becomes the champion. He's not he's not a huge selling champion now. I mean, he was with Jon Jones, but just given the circumstances of all this, I don't think a lot of people are going to tune in to see Daniel Cormier defend his title next. It's just it is what it is. I mean, I hate using that phrase, but this is a sport that's beholden to stars, and they've done what they can to make their roster deep. And to have a situation in which they can regularly put on events. I mean, every weekend you turn on your television, you see a UFC fight, and it may not be the biggest fight or the biggest star of all time, but it's on television, it's getting ratings, and it's producing revenue for the company. But as far as stars, man, you just got to cross your fingers. You got to be proactive and looking around the globe and cultivating talent and finding that talent. But as far as those guys panning out and becoming mainstream stars that can be a Conor McGregor for you, you just hope. You hope that you find one, and when you do, then you build them up and make them as big as possible. But losing Jon Jones is a huge body blow to the UFC. There's no other way to say it.
Brett, big picture here. MMA in its current form has really only been around for about 20 years. The UFC started in the early 90s, but even then, they were still trying to figure out, what is this? And I remember, watching it in the 90s and seeing it evolve into the 2000s. It's unlike the baseballs and the footballs and the basketballs and the hockeys that have basically been around for the 100 years, whereas the UFC is still very early on in the sport, in how society perceives it, and in how they're doing things. How do you think what's going on now with all these people testing positive, how do you think the sport is going to evolve from here?
Well, I don't want to paint a picture that everyone is testing positive now. Actually, ever since USADA came in, they haven't been testing positive left and right. I mean, there's a lot of testing going on in the sport. I can't remember the exact number of tests last year, but we're talking about thousands of drug tests. And
right, it's only like a handful of people, basically.
Yeah, it's not as if this sport has a rampant drug problem where 50% of the roster is being annihilated because of drug testing. I mean, it hurts, of course, when you have a guy with the name of Jon Jones, but I mean, as far as where does the sport go from here in terms of its drug testing, I was in favor of them bringing in USADA. I thought it was a good move. I wanted to see a clean sport. The athletic commissions, when you bounce around from state to state, some of them did it well, others didn't do it well at all. Others basically didn't do it. They don't have the funds to pay for the drug testing because it's expensive. So I thought the sport did the correct thing in bringing in USADA. And again, like I mentioned, they're living with the consequences of it. I think even when you lose a guy like Jon Jones, you almost question the entire system. You're like, "What is this worth it?" I mean, the blow that this is to the sport of mixed martial arts. Maybe we should just not do USADA. But then you remember what it was like 2 years ago when the curtain started to be peeled back, and you saw that a lot of these guys were testing positive because the athletic commissions were doing it themselves. And that wasn't good for the sport either. I mean, no one wanted to walk around and talk about mixed martial arts and say, well, yeah, this guy's probably on it, this guy's probably on it. A guy shows up at a weigh-in, takes his shirt off, and he looks completely different than he did years ago, and you're like, well, that guy's using something. I mean, that wasn't a great spot for the sport either. So it's really a double-edged sword. You have to live with it. I mean, we wanted a clean sport. I am all for a clean sport. And if you have a clean sport, sometimes you run into a situation where your biggest star in Jon Jones is testing positive for something, and that's, unfortunately, you just got to live with that.
Brett, a couple more quick hit questions for you before I let you go, and I appreciate the time as always. Looking at what's next, we know Conor McGregor had his fight with Mayweather a few weeks ago. Is it inevitable that it's going to be the third fight with Diaz, or will he actually defend his belt first?
Well, I think if he does fight Nate Diaz, he will be defending the belt at the same time. I think that'll be a lightweight title fight. I really think that comes down to if the UFC wants to pay Nate Diaz a whole lot of money. You know, Nate has his ideas of how much he should be paid for a trilogy fight with Conor McGregor. If they can come to a deal, then yeah, I like the odds of that fight happening. If Nate and the UFC are butting heads over how much that fight is worth, then then we have a situation where Tony Ferguson is fighting Kevin Lee for an interim title next month, and that could come into the equation.
We saw the situation this past weekend with Ray Borg getting the flu. Apparently, got it from his wife, which is just talk about odd circumstances. They're going to reschedule that fight for Demetrius Johnson. I believe it's October 6th. Looking ahead, if Johnson does defend that belt and becomes, the most, breaks Anderson Silva's record, where do you think history is going to look at Demetrius? Because in many ways, he's really overlooked by a lot of people, but realistically, he may go down as one of the best MMA fighters of all time.
I already see him as the best mixed martial artist of all time, and I mean, you and I could get into probably a long discussion about this. I think that there's a kind of a difference between the best of all time and the greatest of all time. I think there is a kind of a distinction between the two, but in terms of just well-rounded, can't beat him on any given night. I think Demetrius Johnson is the best, most advanced mixed martial artist I have ever seen. How will history remember him? I think it's impossible to answer that until we see the rest of his career, because right now he's not recognized as that, and a lot of people don't give him his due. But I think after he breaks this record, and depending on how many title defenses he ends up getting, I mean, who knows? This guy could end up going on and making 15, 16, 17 title defenses. He could move up in weight and challenge a champion in a weight class ahead of him. So, I think it's premature to talk about Demetrius Johnson's legacy because it hasn't all happened yet. But at this moment, yeah, he is very, very underappreciated, and that I don't think that's going to change even when he does, even if he does break the title record next month.
I was having a conversation real quick before I let you go with a fighter's wife recently. We were talking about this, and I said, I feel like a lot of times the smaller fighters, the Johnsons and some of the other guys, they do get overlooked because of their size, because of the fact that historically, because of boxing, we've been so focused on the heavier weight classes because of the knockouts, because of the physical specimens that some of them are. And whereas, a lot of these guys, if they're 155 and under, we kind of forget about how great they can be. And I think that in some ways, it gets overlooked, and it's hard to actually explain to people sometimes why that is.
It is hard to explain it because, I think casual fans just have a hard time relating to a champion that only weighs 125 pounds. I mean, that's a very small human being. And if you're just a casual football, basketball, baseball fan who happens to be watching a fight, you see it just doesn't resonate. And like you mentioned, it is hard to describe. It's tough because people who are fight fans who watch mixed martial arts on a regular basis, they'll tell you that those are actually some of the best fights because those are the guys who are quick. They just athletically, they can do things that a big, giant 265-pound heavyweight can't do. And so it plays out like a chess match, and it's fascinating to watch these flyweight fights, but it just doesn't translate well to the casual fan. And maybe that will change years and years and years down the road when people are just more accustomed to seeing these smaller fighters. Maybe they can appreciate them. Maybe the UFC, through marketing purposes, can try to change that. But I don't know, man. That just might be human nature, that the people just, on a wide scale, don't get as excited to watch smaller fighters. I mean, that just might be the reality of it.
Yeah. He is Brett Okamoto, ESPN MMA, covers for ESPN. Check out his podcast, the 5 Rounds Podcast. Brett, always appreciate the time. And you know what? Let's just hope moving forward that we can having less conversations about the stuff outside of the octagon and more about what's going on in it.
Man, that'd be great. Deal. Sounds good.
Thanks, Brett. Always appreciate the time.
All right. See you.